Welcome to the Tenement Museum's book talk this evening featuring Daniel Paterna, author of Feast of the Seven Fishes, a Brooklyn Italian's recipe celebrating food and family. I'm Rachael Grygorcewicz. I'm the Vice President of Visitor Operations at the Tenement Museum, and I'm happy to be here virtually with you tonight. And thank you for tuning in. Before we get started, if you're watching this event live, you can ask questions and add comments throughout the evening, and we'll have dedicated time at the end to answer your questions. A little bit about the Tenement Museum, if you're not familiar with it. We're a museum that tells stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the United States, located in New York City's Lower East Side. We are a museum that finds its foundation in stories and storytelling, particularly those of ordinary New Yorkers who lived in a pair of tenement buildings and the ways in which they have shaped and continue to shape our city. Our guest tonight is Daniel Paterna, who has created some of television's most recognizable images. During his career, he has worked with leading content brands, including ABC News, AMC, A&E, Disney, ESPN, History, and PBS. Paterna was born and raised in the house his grandfather built in Brooklyn, graduated from the Pratt Institute with honors in graphic design, and currently heads his own Brooklyn-based design group. His photography has been on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the 440 Gallery in Brooklyn. Most recently, he is the author and photographer of Feast of the Seven Fishes, a Brooklyn Italian's recipes celebrating food and family. This amazing book tells a story of his family's history through recipes, local shops, photographs, and delicious foods his family made for the holidays. Let's get started and jump right in. So Daniel, how are you?
All right, how are you?
I'm okay. Your background is in photography and design. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write a cookbook and a memoir?
Growing up in Brooklyn, I felt that the place I grew up in was sort of a pigeonholed place that was marred by the stereotypical, impressions of Italian Americans. And as I grew older and I moved out of the city in Boston, I took my career to Boston. I began to see a wider landscape of where I came from and the food and culture that existed, that I basically took for granted. And my concern was how do I maintain this same great festive culture on my own? So as I went back to Brooklyn for holidays, I began to document a lot of the work that my mom did. And eventually I wound up writing a short story that the now publisher read before he became my publisher. And he said to me, he says, you might have a book here. So given that, I was very excited to hear that. And I started to write to pictures. A lot of the photographs I had already taken. Subsequently, once I was getting the green light to do the book, I rephotographed and then canvassed the rest of the neighborhood to get their sort of parallel story to mine, because we all came from parents and immigrant parents, grandparents. So and it really came at the time where I was a very young parent, and I saw two little kids, and they're the next generation.
For sure.
Right. And I took up the mantle, pretty much.
For those for our virtual audience, what part of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
I grew up in Bensonhurst, the northern part of Bensonhurst, which is often referred to as Mapleton. Okay. Literally across the street is Borough Park. It was a very industrial zoned area, a lot of abandoned cars when I was a kid, crime, it was just on the outskirts of, it was in between Borough Park and Bensonhurst.
Sure. So the title of your book is The Feast of Seven Fishes. Can you talk a little bit about what that tradition is for those who aren't familiar?
Well, back in the day, way back when the Romans were celebrating the winter solstice, the Christians used to celebrate Christmas under the guise of solstice. And the Southern Italian people, this is unique to their culture. You won't find this in the north of Italy. And seven fishes, the fish is representative of the Christ. And there's an argument of whether it's because of the 7 days of the creation, although on the 7th day he rested, or the 7 sacraments. You make your choice. There's no conclusion on that. Maybe somebody has an answer for me when they chime in at the end of the talk, but that's as far as I know it. So at the Christmas holiday, Christmas Eve is bigger, pretty much, it's bigger than Christmas Day, as a matter of fact. It's more of a long meal that ends at very wee hours of the morning.
I was going to ask you, which tradition do you follow? Was it the 7 sacraments, or? But it sounds like you're still in between. You're not.
Yeah, it's all about the feast, and it's a reason to get together, and whatever it is, it's all in the context of goodwill and family.
Why did you focus on this tradition? What was it about Christmas Eve? And there's a lot of great traditions with Italian heritage. What was it about this specific one that you really wanted to focus on?
Well, it's the focus really was my mother's recipe box. And that recipe box was my holy grail as a kid, because I knew when that recipe box came out that I was going to see my cousins. We were going to be up all night. We were going to cook. We were going to get in trouble. We were going to play cards. We were going to get presents. And the eve is sort of the longest experience of those, dinners. So it's just an amazing feat. It starts 2 weeks ahead of the time we actually sit down. There are 2 types of cod fish that we use. Both are cured. One is cured with salt, mm-hmm. and the other one is air dried in the Arctic. And that takes 2 weeks to rehydrate. Wow. So it starts out early, and it's a 2-week time of utter bliss for me, and when I was a kid, because it seemed to take importance over every other thing, including homework.
I was just gonna say.
My aunts would come over like a week before Christmas Eve and make the strufoli in my grandmother's basement, and it didn't matter. You had an essay to write. You had to roll the strufoli. It just didn't matter, and that adherence to how important it is really resonated with me, because to me it's what everything is all about. I mean, I wasn't a great student, but I managed. But it was great to have this other thing other than school be equally as important as anything else.
And it sounds like it was something that it consumed your whole family. It was everybody yes. in the family. It wasn't just your immediate family.
It was my aunts and uncles, and they'd have coffee weeks leading up to it, and they'd have conversations about where they were going to buy the fish. Henry's was a big highlight, which is on 18th Avenue. And when that closed, it was, when these places close, And I know this is going to sound strange, but it's a gut punch. Because they're more than vending fish and cheese and meat. They're sort of museums and curios of culture. And if not for those shopkeepers who work extremely hard, we would not have the things that we have. And, back in the day, a lot of the Italian American cooking changed because when the Italian immigrants came here, they didn't have all of the ingredients that they had back in Italy. Crabs, for instance.
Right.
Our crab dish that we make for Uncle Robert's birthday every year, he's had crabs on his birthday for at least 50 years. So I took up the mantle of that, and the kids got involved, and it's this big thing. It's a crab fest. We use Maryland blue claw crabs, but back in Italy, they used these little black crabs. They almost look like spiders.
Okay.
And that may be a turnoff to a lot of people watching out there, but, it just became, we adopted whatever we had. It's only now in the past 10, 15 years that you can pretty much get anything.
Right.
Even guanciale.
What is that? We have to talk about that. What is
guanciale? Is like it's ham. It's a pork product. It's
okay.
the cheeks, cured cheeks of the pig that you use in the way that you would use pancetta.
Gotcha.
And if you really want to make a good carbonara, you use guanciale. But back when my mother made it, and she only made it once because that's sort of a Roman dish, she used bacon.
Okay.
Back in the 60s, that's what the Americanization was about. It's just, and that's another point I wanted to make, is that my feeling is that writing this book kind of brought me back to the time when my grandparents arrived. And over that process, the Americanization and the assimilation tends to cast away a lot of the real deep-seated culture that you were born with.
Right.
And that's why I insisted that this book get printed in Italy, because I felt like it was sort of a homecoming, a return to the place that it all began. So I had to, ante up for that cost a little bit.
I'm sure.
But I was determined to have it printed in Italy. It just because and the experience of having printed in Italy, I was speaking to Italian printers, fine Italian printers. They were more concerned about the colors of the Italian flag on the pages. The green had to be just right. It was awesome. And that's kind of the way it is. Right.
It's funny that I just want to segue into another question, and this really ties into a lot of this, the way we view storytelling at the Tenement Museum. So particularly one of our, and we talk a lot about families and family traditions and how they've changed and how children continue some of those traditions. On one of our tours, we talk about families playing all kinds of different roles in the kitchen, with cooking, and this is a big part of this book. One of our residents was in charge of turning the beans every time he and his brother got home from school. What was something that you were in charge of, or can you talk a little bit about your experience with your mother or your grandmother, and what were you in charge of in terms of cooking or being in the kitchen?
I, as a young kid, a toddler, I was in charge with the cheese grater, which is there's a photograph of it in the book, and we still use it today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my kids, you have no idea what it feels like when I saw our kids standing behind the grater turning that thing. Because anyway, grating the bread and the cheese, the stale bread to make breadcrumbs. And the chunks of cheese for topping on your pasta or whatever dish that you were making. Decanting the olive oil from bigger cans into little bottles. Making sure all the labels on the shelves were facing forward, so you could read it easily because, in our kitchen everything happened chop, chop, chop. There was no, because, and you had to be at the table when it was served because it's hot, and it had to be eaten when it was hot. Otherwise, you know, but I have a funny story. When I got older to be a teenager, I was charged because my mom started to work. She went back to work. She was one of those miracle moms who did everything in the house and went back to work in the 70s. And I think I was in my first freshman in high school. And she says, Daniel, can you boil the pasta when I get home? Prepare the pasta. So I was so excited. I took a box of Ronzoni at the time because it's either Ronzoni or Prince. And I boiled the pasta at 3:00 in the afternoon to be ready for dinner. And she came home all excited that all this was going to be ready. And she looked in the pot and it was still in the water. So it was the soggy, goopy. Said, hey, what'd you do? I says, I cooked the pasta. I wanted to keep it warm. So there you go. I mean, I'm so not a chef. I mean, I learned by trial and error in the kitchen, our kitchen was a tough place. In fact, when we sat down to dinner, my mother would she'd recall dishes that she made years ago in comparison to the dish that she was eating that night. And she would say, these crabs were better, 3 years ago or whatever. And this was the conversation in our family. And when friends would come over, they were amazed that we were so almost nitpicky critical about the food. But it wasn't about being nitpicky. It was about making it the way that it's supposed to be.
Right.
And that's pretty much it.
Exactly. Yeah. I was going to say, what was something what was a favorite task of yours, or even today, in helping your mom? What was something you really looked forward to?
Rolling the little meatballs for the lasagna was one, because we got to do it with my cousins. We'd stand around the table and my father would come in and out of the room and he'd look and see what we're doing. And if they were too big, we had to do them over. If they were too small, you had to do them over. They just had to be right. It goes back to the same. and then we would just be laughing, goofing around with each other, waiting for him to leave so we can goof around. And it's so much about the connection to food and people and the people that you love. That really is why these traditions continue. I mean, the food is great. We invite a lot of guests over and they just can't believe it. In fact, sometimes they get warned, don't eat so much, by other people who have been to the house before. Get ready because it's business.
Right.
And the other thing that I love to do was make the Easter bread. When that pan came out of the closet in the white bin, I don't know. It was just like a miracle. The bread, because my grandmother would bring it into our bedroom, because in our bedroom was the warmest place in the house. And she'd come in early in the morning and check on it, and it was just this comforting notion, that of process, that it was everyone's involved, and
Right.
We got up and it rose over the pan, and it was like Christmas in a way.
Right. I want to take a look at some of the photographs from the book in just a few minutes, but I do have a couple more. I want to talk a little bit about some of the vendors and some of the shops that you highlight in the book. We talked a little bit about this before, but when I think people, particularly people not from New York City, when they think of New York or they think of Brooklyn, they think of it as this huge, vast space, this huge city. But to me, I feel New York is really, it's really about community, and it's made up of little clusters of different communities. And I think this book highlights so much of that.
Mhm.
For Bensonhurst, for different parts of Brooklyn. But you talk a lot about some of the shops and the vendors that your family got the food from, that you would shop at for the feast and other traditions. Can you talk about one particular shop or vendor in the book that you have a unique story or experience with?
That would have to be, and not because of any preference. It's just that surrounding the Feast of the Seven Fishes, the shopping for the fish was like going to the theater, because you'd stand online at Seabreeze 2 was the name of the shop that unfortunately shuttered 2 years ago. And again, it was huge. I almost lost my breath when I found out. And I stood there post closing, and I read the sign on the, shuttered gate, and people would come up and shake their heads, and I would record some of their reactions, because Angelo, he was like a director. He knew he had a line of people. He had fish literally packed on the sidewalk, covered in ice. And you stood online speaking to people that you didn't know. And the commonality of sharing each family's version of the same dish was such a unifying homespun experience. And everyone was just so eager to get in to give Angelo the order of what you wanted. And when you got in there, it was just a beehive of activity. Everybody was moving, and Angelo would be on the phone outside in the corner talking to his truck drivers in the Bronx from Hunts Point, yelling and screaming. And it was just fun. It was just fun, and to be there, especially with my mom, she would look forward to it the same way. And we took my son, Luca, who was at the time in second grade, and he had a class project to do. And he decided on his own he wanted to take pictures of the preparation.
Oh, wow.
And one of the pictures in one of my clips on my Instagram feed that I haven't posted yet, it's about making calamari. There's a photograph I took of him with my mom standing online, and the expression on my mother's face, like you can't make it up, because that, to her, that was the next level.
Right.
And he'd come home, he cleaned calamari with my brother, and then, I'd put the two kids on the counter, and my daughter doesn't like fish, but she hung in there. And the most profound thing, when my mom passed away in 2013, the following year, my daughter Madeline, who didn't necessarily come with us to the market, she decided she was going to come with us. So my son, I, and my daughter Madeline came as moral support.
Right.
Because it was, she knew that it was a meaningful thing.
Right.
And it's a rewarding sensation to have that happen.
So I want to share some of the photographs that you took. I'm going to share the screen. As I'm kind of setting it up, Daniel, can you just speak a little bit? We talked about some of the recipes and the stories of your family, but can you talk a little bit about, you took all of the photographs yourself? Why was this an important part of the book for you? If you could just kind of talk through that as I'm setting up the share screen.
Why was it important? That's a hard answer. First of all, I shot everything on film because I felt that, and I used, a lot of the times I used my father's old movie projector light. I wanted to portray the food that we grew up with, that was ubiquitous and omnipresent, to the point where we took it for granted. And I wanted to highlight and glorify the simplicity of something that we just assumed, like, lentils and pasta lentique, pasta fagioli. It's like, it's the equivalent to rice and beans for the, for the Latino culture. And so I really took heart into doing justice to very simple dishes. And on the very cover, there's a picture of a stuffed calamari. And I know a lot of people get squeamish, but if you've ever had a stuffed calamari, you would not ever forget it. And that sort of is a ubiquitous dish that is gone out of favor because of labor that's involved. And it also is symbolic of a dish that was given to us as a family by my aunt and Uncle Joe before we took our trip across the country. And back in 1966, you were barely allowed to go around the block, let alone across the country in a six-cylinder Rambler that had a very weak, cooling system. And I remember distinctly that was the dish that so emphasized to us the importance of what we were about to do. And it's like rolling out the red carpet in our family. And I know it's been played out and it's become sort of a stereotype, symbolic image, but I was determined to get that calamari on the cover.
It's a great cover. It's a great photo.
When I designed the cover, I kind of wanted it to be a cross between the Bible and some Italian novel, like. And that's my family in the photograph on the right-hand side of those tables.
Over on right here on the
Yeah.
right.
Yes. In fact, the guy making fun, putting the apple in his mouth is Uncle Joe Zarella. He was always a comic.
Let's go through the slides, and you can maybe take us through
So here is a spread for in the section that I highlighted, Seabreeze 2.
Right.
And Lily up on the left-hand corner in the lower right is Angelo's wife in the upper right-hand corner. And you can see Angelo's expression on his face is just priceless. Always the director, yelling, screaming, complaining. And on the lower hand corner, you always had, at this holiday season, these colorful characters who came in from the neighborhood. I'm sure they were friends of his, to help out, to vend fish. And it was like a reunion.
Yeah. These mom and pop stores and shops in New York, there's just a sense of family throughout them.
Mm-hmm.
That I think really unique to this city. Want to take us through?
Yeah, I love this picture of Mario. This is 100 years. This bakery, pastry shop, Savarese, is 100 years old, and he's only the second owner of the shop.
Wow.
And this is the place that I went to when I was a kid. It was literally 2 blocks away. And as you pointed out earlier, we didn't know anything but to shop local.
Right.
Before it was a trend.
Right.
Great trend. But like you said, I was sort of criticized by some of my Instagram friends that the book didn't include, and rightfully so. Well, you didn't include this shop and that shop and this shop, and there are 15 shops highlighted in the book. And my explanation is that this is a very intimate story about a very intimate place. And like you said, we didn't really travel that far. It was all about the relationship our family had with the shop owners.
Right.
And they're like family.
It's so important. Yep, absolutely.
And, to this day, I live in Park Slope now on 12th Street, and I go back to the neighborhood to shop. and I still have a relationship and a rapport. We were in front of Villa Labate selling books in front of a Piaggio Ape on Sunday. If anyone missed it, we're going to be at the Brooklyn Flea this weekend on Saturday. I bring home stuff from these shops and bring it to my neighbors because I just have to show them how good this stuff is. Like the bread from Pan Antico it was artisanal before artisanal was even a word. My father, when he first came home with this bread in his hand, it was like he won $1 million because he read about this in a magazine that was a brand new magazine in the early 80s called Brooklyn Bridge, I think it was the name of it. And I highlighted Pan Antico. And there was Joseph Generosa with his dad. And, I got the inside scoop on how that bread was put together. And that alone is a story.
Right. Absolutely. For sure.
This is United. That's Joe and United. Joe and Rocco own United Butcher. And these guys are in my immediate neighborhood. They're on Prospect Park West in Windsor Terrace. And what I came to learn about them is that they delivered for the butcher that my mother went to.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And when Joe Leo closed, everyone went like this. Because again, it was another place that had just as much activity as all the other places I reference in the book. But these guys used to deliver meat to my mother's house. And we became fast friends.
Yep.
And to me, it's my little home away from home extension to the neighborhood.
Right. And they're local to you now.
They're local to me now, yeah. And I've introduced them to some of the restaurants in the neighborhood for their prime provisions. And now they're getting business from, other places.
Other places, right.
Oh my God. I love this photograph. It's just Fredo, the guy on the right, he started Queen Anne Ravioli. He started in the business as a macaroni machine vendor, pasta machine vendor.
Right.
And he worked at another ravioli place called, I believe it was called Dairy Maid. I forget. And he opened up Queen Anne. And that's his grandson holding the box. That's his brother-in-law behind the grandson, and that's Frank, who made all of the frittatas and the tortas. He was the cook. And Fredo fixes his own machinery because he's got a pasta maker machine from 1918. Can't get parts for. And he literally repairs it himself.
Wow. That's amazing.
And they're my favorite ravioli. And I have a secret. I was in a shop in Park Slope. And when I moved to Park Slope, I went in and got these ravioli. And I said to myself, God, these ravioli are so good. They were no name. It was just the name of the store that was on it. And when I went in to photograph these guys, I said, there's a place that I go to buy ravioli, and I swear they taste just like your ravioli. And those are his ravioli. He just makes them. He puts their label on them. Queen Anne ravioli are just great. I mean, there are pastosa ravioli, but I have an affinity to these guys.
And here we go with some photos of the fish, of the 7 fishes.
Yeah. This is totally my headspace right here because there are the decorations that get paraded out of the cardboard boxes. My mom outside, that's her shopping list. And there's on the right, the bacala soaking in the water.
Right, of course.
That's all.
One of the questions in the chat that came through before we went to the photographs, one of the members of the audience asked how scungil was part of your traditions on Christmas Eve.
Scungili was unfortunately it was the orphan dish that came out when my mother came back from midnight mass from singing in the choir at 1 o'clock in the morning, or maybe 2, because we never got to it. She had to leave early. Sometimes I would go with her. So that was sort of held until we got back.
Okay.
And at that point, a lot of us weren't as hungry as we were then.
Sure.
So we wound up, that was one of the last dishes we'd have. And it was served on top of a hard biscuit called frizzelle.
Okay.
It's a dry biscuit with bread with black pepper in it. And you dampen it in the water, put it on the plate, put the scungili. And the name scungili is only indigenous to the East Coast of the United States.
Really?
If you say that word in California, they don't know what you're talking about. If you go to, this doesn't exist in Italy, it's conch.
Right.
But it's scungili. I don't know what the evolution of that word is. Maybe somebody has a good answer, but there's a famous place in the city that's just all about scungili, Vincent's Clam Bar, and then another place in Brooklyn in Bushwick called Frost.
Okay.
And if you've never had it, it's really.
I've had it a couple of times.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah.
It's delicious.
Yep. We have some more photos of the fishes. We have the eel.
That's my son in the right-hand corner looking at the eel. The eel is very traditional. It's that's the one that gets sold very quickly.
Why is that?
I don't know the complete answer to that. I think of all the fishes, that's sort of the most spiritual, if that's the word I can use, and the most traditional, and it's rare. It's only the shop would only have it around the holiday.
Okay.
So it would go very quickly.
For sure.
And this is Christmas Day. And the sauce recipe, my sauce recipe, based on my mom's.
Tell us about that. Tell us about your sauce recipe. I'm sure many people are interested in hearing about that. How did you adapt it from your mom's recipe?
She never used wine. I use red wine after I brown all the meat. And I start with the ribs first, and then the sausage, and then the braciole, and then I save the meatballs for last, so the oil is nice and fatty to fry them in. And then once the meatballs are out, half cooked, I douse the bottom of the pan with red wine and swish it all together, and remove all that caramelization. And it's just the smell of that on Christmas Day is, I don't know, it's just amazing.
That's great. It's your tradition. It's your tradition for Christmas Day, not Christmas Eve. It's your
Christmas Day, yes. So
yeah.
I do both the eve and the day. When back in the day, my aunt Josie and Uncle Joe, my godfather, who lived in Borough Park in a very small apartment, 4 rooms, we'd fit 15 people around the table, and they would do the eve, and my mom would do the day. But now, I do all of it.
You do all of it
with help from the kids.
And that's how you've brought the traditions into your own home.
Exactly.
Right.
And I try and do my best to serve it in very similar dishes, if not the same dishes that my grandmother used. In fact, the photograph of the ricotta cheesecake is in my grandmother's plate.
Oh, wow.
And I feel like when I bring these things home and my children see there's a history behind these objects. Someone wrote a book about the history of New York in 100 objects, but I don't remember what the amount of objects there were. It's almost the same thing, and I think every family has the same stock of old stuff that was just sitting there, but are full of paragraphs of where they came from, who broke it, who chipped it, who fixed it, who made it. Like the bread pan was made by my father's brother, my grandfather, who I'd never met. He was a sheet metal operator, and he made these schoolhouse shrouds for out of porcelain tin. They were tin porcelainized. So my grandmother needed a big bread pan to make Easter bread in, and he brought one home with two handles on it, and it was an inverted shroud for a lamp. He just didn't cut the hole out for the bulb. And I illustrate that in a little film I made on my Instagram. And I have my son standing under the pan holding a light bulb, giving me a hard time, of course. but that to me is an awesome story. They didn't go out and get a pan, they made it. And I don't know, kitchen equipment wasn't readily available to the homeowner back in the day. And
it's irreplaceable.
Irreplaceable,
absolutely.
Yeah. That bread pan is older than me. It's all close to 100 years old.
Wow. And you'll pass that down.
And my kids, I have this picture in there, my kids sitting around it, poking holes in the bread. And the bread went in their room to rise, just like it was in my room to rise overnight.
These are more photos of.
So this is Christmas Day. That's the antipasti on the left. That's sort of the way my father used to arrange it. It was all on one plate, not separate dishes. And it looked like this, Raphael painting.
Beautiful. The photos are just beautiful.
Thank you. And those are stuffed peppers. My friend John Tamarchio's mom. Those are Mrs. Tamarchio's stuffed cherry peppers. And those are the upper right of my friends around the table for Christmas Eve, and my wife's lovely, impeccable table settings.
Absolutely. This is beautiful. So take us through these photographs.
So the upper left is a photograph of our Christmas Eve dinner. My father's not there. I think it may have been the same year he passed, or the year after. And my mom's on the left. My brother, my sister-in-law, my wife, friends of the family on the right-hand side. And the bottom are the two kids in front of grandma's tree. And my son's hands steeped in making the dough for the torta di ricotta. And the upper right-hand corner is one of my mom's cards.
How old was your son when you took that photo?
He's probably middle schooler, beginning, if not a fourth grader. I honestly don't remember. I have to look. This has been a 7-year project.
Yeah. I was just gonna say.
It came out last year, but it took a lot to do.
And this is your mother.
That's my mother on the right. Which I love this clip. This is a film frame from my father's 8mm film he took of her in the alleyway, which I absolutely love.
It's a great photo.
He was a filmmaker of his own, right? And I think that's where I picked up a lot of my awareness of imagery. And that picture on the left is the two of them, my mom and my dad's wedding picture, portrayed in front of the bread pan. And the same string that was tied with. Wow. From back when it hung in my Aunt Josie's apartment. My grandmother wanted to give it to my Aunt Josie, and she couldn't keep it in the apartment any longer because it was too damn big in a former apartment. So that's how it got handed down to my father, because he was the youngest of the 4 brothers. So then that's when it was stored in my parents' house. And I felt it was a poignant photograph. This is my grandmother, my mom's parents. My mom is the middle child with the glasses on. And she was the archivist.
Your mother.
Oh my God. If you look at our recipe cards, we didn't make these dishes every year. So she would type them out and put them in the box. But every year, without fail, she would have to make phone calls to her relatives and find out when the timing for certain ingredients were added. And she'd make notations. She'd put whiteout, pencil, pen. She'd write all over them. They were patinaed. They look like Mozart's manuscripts to me. And her two sisters on either side of her, my youngest Aunt Dolores and Aunt Madeline on my mom's left shoulder, and my grandmother Louisa, and my grandfather, the tailor, Pasquale. Yeah.
And I'm just gonna show both your grandfather and your grandmother because they're on separate slides. But in your book, if you could, and I do want to get to some questions from the audience, but in your book, you do talk a little bit about a very sweet, how they met and then how he then proposed to your grandma. If you could kind of just talk through that.
Yeah, my grandfather came to the United States early on. He got an apartment in Coney Island. He went to school. He learned English. He also spoke French. He was fairly educated. He was from Caserta, Capua, which is the same town Spartacus came from. A little bit of information.
There you go.
And he met my grandmother in a candy store in Red Hook that one of my grandmother's relatives worked in. And my grandmother would come to the United States as a sort of nanny, a doula for her people that she knew in the United States. And she had to go back, and it's unsure whether she went back because she had to, or she went back because she was intimidated because she was illiterate in both English and Italian, could not write and speak, and she never went. She was, if anyone has ever seen the movie Ciao Professore, she was one of those kids that never went to school. She had the heart of a lion, and she met my grandfather in Red Hook. When she went back to Italy, she had to get her niece, Giuseppina, to write letters for her.
Mm-hmm.
And Giuseppina became the medium in between. And my grandfather told my grandmother that when he was ready to marry her, he would write to her. She waited 10 years. And my cousin who lives in Buffalo, Anna, I'm going to cry. She said, I went to my grandmother's church she was married in Grygorcewicz, and she told me that Giuseppina always never gave up on Pasquale. She said, Luigi, one day he's going to write. So my Luigi, Giuseppina would go down to the center of the town and pick up the mail. They didn't come to the house. They had to go to the post office.
Right.
And she came running up the street the day that the letter arrived. Giuseppina, Luigi, Pasquale è scritto. And that was the letter that he proposed marriage, believe it or not.
Wow.
They got married in church in Grygorcewicz. They went to Venice for their honeymoon, and they came back, and my grandfather worked hard enough where he had enough money to put a house together. I don't know how he did it, and that was the beginning of the whole story.
Right.
And these are pictures of their passport photos.
Right. That's what I'm just going back.
And they're unbelievably beautiful.
They're beautiful.
It's just beautiful. A bureaucratic piece of material like that turns out to be a piece of art.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
And this is Pastore's ravioli. This is the main brand, the main headquarters. It's on Utrecht Avenue and 75th Street. It's a 2x4 place, and I remember standing on that very line, being let in. This is an iconic place.
I love Pastosa. I've
Yeah.
been there a few times. It's a wonderful place. I brought my mother there too.
They were one of the first ones to actually start getting online and selling their wares, their products.
We're gonna go through the last bit of photos a little more quickly because we have about
Sure.
10 minutes, and I do want to get back to the audience and take some of their questions. But I wanted to talk. I think you mentioned the meat market already.
Joe and Rachael in my neighborhood.
Windsor.
Yeah, Windsor Terrace.
And this
there's Angelo.
Your beloved Seabreeze.
Oh, there he is. That's his personality right there.
It's a great picture.
I took that with a 2 1/4 camera, and believe me, to get him when he's not in motion is, I didn't ask him to pose. I didn't ask any of these guys to pose really for these kind of shots. And when I saw that image come up, I was.
This is also Pastosa.
The right-hand corner is Papa Pasquale. He's pointing out his parents, his grandparents in the photograph. It's a museum to Brooklyn memorabilia, Italian-American memorabilia. And the lower left-hand corner are the shop storefronts that just are beautiful. They're just works of art.
And this photograph, can you just speak to this? This is one of your mother's.
Yeah, this is a moment when I realized I needed to get both of these images in the same spot. Her hand on the cards that she authored, her writing. It's a portrait of happiness.
I was going to say too, it's a portrait of your family's traditions. This is your
exactly.
This is it right here.
Well, you can see all of the schematics that she's got on that card, man.
Yeah.
Decipher that? That's for the frutta di mare, sea salad on the top for 4.
Right.
Believe it or not, you could feed 12 people with that.
Okay. So I'm just going to end this and get us back to the chats. Okay.
There you are.
There I am. Exactly. There you are. I have two questions that came up. We talked a lot about your mother, but what did your dad do to prepare for the feast?
My dad, there's a drawing in the book that I asked my brother to do. My brother's an engineer. He's got amazing pencil skills. My father was in charge of the grab bag, and he was pretty much driving my mom around to different shops. And when he passed away, it was my brother and I who were taking up that mantle. And he was always complaining that we were making too much food to my mother. Because my mother would say, you don't know who's going to come over. You got to be ready. Company's going to come. Cousin Vinny may come over. So she was all about feeding everybody. And he would go out days leading up to Christmas Eve, and he would devise these machinations for grab bags. And one of them was ingenious, where he would write names on the end of a string, send the string to an empty cardboard paper towel holder, and on the end of that string were the various presents that he would get. And I would go down to sometimes Chambers Street. There was an old job lot. I'd go with my godfather and him. We'd take a ride on Saturday morning, and he'd buy just oddball things for people as a goof. And people were in hysterics because you would never find these. These are all, Odd Lot was a place where discontinued items are sold. As a matter of fact, one day he came home with, believe it or not, a whole entire chicken in a can.
Oh my God.
Bones and all. So you could find,
That's a
So
good.
he didn't bring that home for Christmas, but and at the end of each rope, people would pull their string with the name on it, not knowing what they were going to get. So that was sort of his thing, and he was sort of a man ahead of his time in a way. He was worldly, and he wasn't somebody who liked too much festivity, but I got to give him credit. He hung in there. And he got his joy out of that. And he was in charge of a way to devised a way to keep the water that was dripping into the bacala pan overnight for 2 weeks to not make noise. He wrapped a string around the nozzle of the spigot, and then the water ran down the string into the water, and you didn't hear the drip, 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 drip. That was like a big deal.
Definitely a man ahead of his time.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. Somebody also asked, I think this is a great question. Where do you shop for fish now?
There's a place in Bensonhurst on 69th Street and 18th Avenue called Mondello. And a block away from that is a place called Christopher Columba, I think. Either one of those I go. And in a pinch, I shop here. I was surprised here in my neighborhood they had scungili fresh, frozen fresh. It's never really fresh. It's always frozen.
Frozen fresh. And then another question that came through, we talked a lot about food and family, but one of the things someone is asking, were there any songs your family would play or sing at these large meals? How did music play into this, if it did?
In the book, I do a little short synopsis on this place called Little Records. It was on 18th Avenue between 63rd and 62nd Street. Tino was the shop owner, and my mom and I would go there for Italian records, imported records.
Okay.
And my mother came home with this Italian record, and I'm not going to know the name of the director. It's called Bon Natale. It's all songs sung by Italian children. And the sound of their voices breaks you back. It's just, they're so beautiful. And that record pretty much, outside of Frosty the Snowman and, All I Want for Christmas, that seems to resonate the most for me. I'm going to post it on my Instagram account.
Okay.
What the name of the record of the album is, but it's really beautiful.
Please, I'm sure everyone would love to know that. And I think we have time for one more, and I think this is a good one to end on. Have you had?
Wait, we're going to end?
We have to. Although I could talk to you forever. You have great stories, but have you had friends from different cultures come and experience these amazing traditions? And what were some of their reactions?
Oh yeah. Well, I have a lot of Jewish friends. My father had a lot of various culture cross. He was, again.
That's New York.
Right? He just went out of the neighborhood, and the first time I had Pakistani food was because of my father. The first time I had Turkish food was because of my father. Any Middle Eastern food, and he had a lot of Jewish friends. And now today I have a close friend who lives around the corner, and I invited him, and they just don't believe. They can't. Their eyes fall out of their heads. They just they've seen nothing like it. Really, it's just really. Now it's becoming sort of a vogue thing, and unfortunately, restaurants are having a hard go. But before that, placards would portray Feast of the Seven Fishes.
Yeah.
Because it's become sort of a big highlight. So yes, in fact, in Easter, we often refer to Easter as G-ster because we have more Jewish people around our table than Christians.
Like I said, that's New York.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of everybody. That's
it's all about sharing and,
Absolutely. That's what makes this city what it is and how great it is. It's fantastic. So, Daniel, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. It was really fun to learn about your family, to learn about these foods, these recipes. You have a great family, and thank you so much for putting it together in this book for us. For those of you who are watching, you can purchase The Feast of the Seven Fishes at the Tenement Museum's online shop, and there will be a link to our shop on the chat that some of you have posed questions. And stay tuned for future Tenement Museum virtual events. You can find out more by signing up for our newsletter at tenement.org. And we hope you'll join us again. And happy holidays, Daniel.
Happy holiday to you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Happy New Year. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. And everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.